It was almost 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night when General Patricia Williams finally left the Pentagon building. She had spent another long day in back-to-back meetings about military operations overseas. Her black sedan pulled out of the parking garage as she thought about the presentation. She needed to prepare for the next morning. The drive home usually took about 30 minutes through the quiet suburban roads of Virginia. Patricia had made this same trip hundreds of times over the past 5 years. She knew every traffic light, every turn, and every speed limit sign along the way. Tonight felt different, though. Construction crews had been working on the main highway for weeks, forcing drivers to take detours through residential neighborhoods. Orange cones and temporary signs created a maze of reduced speed zones. Patricia carefully watched her speedometer, making sure to stay well under the posted limits. She was wearing a simple black business suit, the same professional attire she wore to most Pentagon meetings. Her military decorations and rank insignia were back in her office. To anyone looking at her car that night, she appeared to be just another professional woman heading home after a long day at work. The red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror just as she turned onto Maple Street. Patricia's heart sank a little, but she wasn't worried. She had been driving carefully, following all traffic rules. Maybe the officer needed to get past her for an emergency call. She pulled over to the side of the road and waited. The police car stopped behind her and 2 officers got out. Through her side mirror, she could see them walking toward her vehicle. Both looked young, probably in their late 20s or early 30s. Patricia rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, exactly as she had been taught in military training when dealing with civilian law enforcement. She had gone through this drill before, though it had been years since her last traffic stop. "Good evening, officers," she said politely as the first policeman approached her window. "Is there a problem?" Officer Martinez leaned down to look into her car. His partner, Officer Thompson, stood slightly behind him with a flashlight. Both men wore serious expressions. "License and registration," Martinez said without answering her question. "You were speeding back there." Patricia felt confused. She had been watching her speed carefully because of all the construction zones. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't think I was speeding. I was actually driving under the limit because of the construction signs." She reached slowly into her purse to get her driver's license, making sure to announce each movement. "I'm reaching for my license now," she said clearly. Martinez took her license and looked at it. "Wait here," he said, walking back toward the police car with Thompson. Patricia sat in her car, watching the officers in her rearview mirror. They seemed to be having an intense conversation by their patrol car. She glanced at her watch. It was now past 11:15 p.m. The street was mostly empty except for a few houses with lights still on. After about 10 minutes, both officers returned to her car. This time Thompson took the lead. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Thompson said in a firm tone. Patricia felt her stomach tighten. This was not how traffic stops usually went. "Officer, may I ask why you need me to get out of the car?" I was cooperating fully. "Just step out of the car," Martinez repeated, his voice more aggressive now. Patricia slowly opened her door and stepped onto the sidewalk. She was about 5 feet 6 inches tall and both officers towered over her. The night air was cool and she could see her breath in small puffs. "Is there a specific reason you pulled me over?" she asked calmly. "I was following all traffic laws." Thompson shined his flashlight directly into her face. "You were going 15 over the speed limit in a construction zone." "Officer, I respectfully disagree. I was watching my speedometer very carefully. I was actually going under the speed limit because of the construction signs." The tension in the air suddenly became thick. Patricia could see both officers exchange glances. Their body language had shifted from routine to confrontational. "Are you calling us liars?" Martinez asked, stepping closer to her. "No, sir. I'm simply telling you what I observed about my own driving. I believe there may be a misunderstanding." Patricia reached slowly into her jacket pocket. "Officers, I'd like to show you my military identification. I'm a general at the Pentagon, and I'm very familiar with following rules and regulations." Thompson immediately became alert. "Keep your hands where we can see them." "I'm just reaching for my military ID," Patricia said calmly, showing her movements clearly. "I'm a brigadier general with the United States Army." Both officers looked at the military identification card, but their expressions didn't soften. If anything, they seemed more annoyed. "I don't care what your job is," Martinez said, handing the ID back to her. You were speeding and now you're arguing with us." Patricia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. In her 25 years of military service, she had commanded thousands of soldiers. She had served in combat zones and handled international crises. But standing on this quiet suburban street, she suddenly felt very alone. "Officers, I'm not arguing. I'm simply asking for clarification about the traffic violation. This is my right as a citizen." "You're right." Thompson laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Lady, your right is to follow our instructions without giving us attitude." Patricia took a deep breath. She had faced much more dangerous situations than this, but something about the officer's tone was setting off alarm bells in her mind. Her military training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but it had also taught her to recognize when a situation was escalating unnecessarily. "I would like to request a supervisor." "Please," she said in her most professional voice. The two officers looked at each other again. The look they shared made Patricia's heart start beating faster. "A supervisor?" Martinez said. "For a simple speeding ticket? What are you trying to pull here?" "I'm not trying to pull anything. I simply want to resolve this situation properly. Requesting a supervisor is standard procedure." Thompson stepped even closer to her. "Standard procedure is you accepting your ticket and moving on. But you want to keep talking back to us." Patricia felt the situation slipping away from her control. These officers were treating her simple questions as some kind of rebellion. She had spent decades in leadership positions, and she knew the difference between asking legitimate questions and being disrespectful. But standing there on Maple Street at 11:30 p.m., with two increasingly aggressive police officers, Patricia Williams realized that her rank, her service record, and her years of dedication to her country might not matter at all. The moment Patricia asked for a supervisor, something shifted in both officers. What had started as a routine traffic stop was now becoming something much more serious. Officer Martinez stepped back and spoke into his radio, but Patricia couldn't hear what he was saying. "Ma'am, turn around and put your hands behind your back," Thompson commanded. Patricia felt her world tilt. "Excuse me?" "Officer, what are you doing? I haven't committed any crime here. Turn around now," Martinez shouted, returning from his radio call. "You're being non-compliant and resistant." Patricia's military training kicked in. She had been in tense situations before, but this felt completely different. These officers seemed to be treating her calm questions as some kind of threat. "Officers, please. I am being completely compliant. I've answered all your questions, provided my identification, and followed your instructions. Asking for a supervisor is not resistance." But Thompson was already reaching for his handcuffs. "You've been arguing with us from the moment we approached your car. That's obstruction." Patricia couldn't believe what was happening. In all her years of military service, including deployments in conflict zones, she had never felt as powerless as she did right now on this quiet suburban street. "I have not been arguing. I have been asking legitimate questions about the traffic stop. This is my constitutional right." "Constitutional right?" Martinez laughed harshly. "Lady, you don't have the right to give us attitude and then demand special treatment because of your job." Patricia's voice remained steady, but inside she was struggling to understand how the situation had spiraled so quickly. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same treatment any citizen should receive." Thompson grabbed her arm. "Turn around right now or we'll turn you around." Patricia slowly turned around, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "Officers, I am complying with your instructions, but I want it noted that I am being handcuffed without being told what crime I've committed." The cold metal handcuffs clicked around her wrists. They were tighter than they needed to be, and Patricia could feel them cutting into her skin. She had put handcuffs on prisoners before during her military service, and she knew these were unnecessarily tight. "The crime is obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," Martinez said. Though Patricia had done neither of those things, a car drove by slowly, and Patricia could see the driver's shocked face as they took in the scene. A professional-looking woman in a business suit being handcuffed by two police officers. The driver slowed down even more, clearly trying to understand what they were witnessing. "Keep moving," Thompson yelled at the car, which quickly sped away. Patricia was walked to the back of the police car. The officers opened the door and guided her inside, placing their hands on her head to make sure she didn't hit the roof of the car. She had seen this procedure hundreds of times in movies and on television, but experiencing it herself was completely different. The back seat of the police car smelled like disinfectant and something else she couldn't identify. There were no door handles on the inside, and a thick plastic barrier separated her from the front seats. Patricia had never felt so trapped in her life. Through the window, she could see more cars driving by. A few slowed down and she could see people pulling out their phones. Some were clearly taking pictures or recording videos of the scene. Thompson got into the driver's seat and turned around to look at her. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before giving officers a hard time." "Officer, I gave you no hard time. I answered your questions politely and provided all requested identification. I simply asked for clarification about the traffic violation and requested a supervisor." "You were being sarcastic and argumentative from the start," Martinez said. Getting into the passenger seat, Patricia felt like she was living in an alternate reality. She replayed the entire interaction in her mind, trying to find the moment where she had been sarcastic or argumentative. She couldn't find it. "Officers, may I please know what happens next? Am I being arrested? Am I free to go?" "You're being detained while we figure out what to charge you with," Thompson said. Patricia's legal training from her military career kicked in. "Detained for what specific crime? You need probable cause to detain someone." "There you go again," Martinez said, turning around to face her. "Always got something to say, don't you?" The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. Patricia had commanded soldiers in life-and-death situations. She had briefed generals and politicians on matters of national security. She had earned her position through decades of dedicated service and proven leadership. But sitting in the back of that police car, handcuffed and humiliated, none of that seemed to matter. She was just another person who had supposedly talked back to police officers. More cars were slowing down now. Patricia could see at least 3 people with their phones out, clearly recording the scene. Part of her felt embarrassed to be seen this way, but another part of her was grateful that there would be evidence of what was happening. "Looks like you're getting your 15 minutes of fame," Thompson said, noticing the phones pointed in their direction. "I never wanted any fame. I just wanted to understand why I was being pulled over. And we told you, speeding in a construction zone, but that wasn't good enough for you." Patricia closed her eyes and tried to center herself. She had been trained to stay calm under pressure, but this situation was testing every bit of her composure. The handcuffs were cutting off circulation to her fingers, and her shoulders were starting to ache from the awkward position. A young woman had gotten out of her car and was openly recording the scene with her phone. She was standing about 20 feet away, clearly trying to document what was happening. "Ma'am, are you okay?" the woman called out. Thompson immediately got out of the car and approached the woman. "Move along." "This is police business." "I'm on a public sidewalk," the woman replied. "I have a right to be here." Patricia watched through the window as Thompson argued with the woman who refused to stop recording. More people were gathering now, some getting out of their cars to see what was happening. The situation was becoming a scene, and Patricia realized that her quiet traffic stop had turned into a public spectacle. She sat in the back of the police car, handcuffed and humiliated, while strangers recorded her lowest moment. But even as embarrassment washed over her, Patricia couldn't shake the feeling that something very wrong had happened here. She had done nothing to deserve this treatment, and she knew it. The question was, would anyone else believe her story when this was all over? Rachel, the young woman who had been recording the incident, uploaded the video to her social media accounts as soon as she got home that night. She captioned it simply, "Watched police handcuff a woman for asking questions during a traffic stop." This didn't seem right. The video was only 3 minutes long, but it captured the most important moments. You could clearly see Patricia in her business suit, speaking calmly to the officers. You could hear her polite questions and her attempts to show her military identification. Most importantly, you could see the exact moment when the situation escalated from a conversation to an arrest. Within 2 hours, the video had been shared 50 times. By morning, it had been viewed over 10,000 times. People began sharing it with comments like, "This is exactly what's wrong with policing, and look how professional she stayed even while being treated like this." Local news reporter David Chen was scrolling through social media during his morning coffee when he saw the video. Something about the woman's calm demeanor caught his attention. He shared it on his news station's page with the caption, "Viral video raises questions about local police conduct." That's when things really took off. The video reached Jennifer Washington, a military veteran who recognized something familiar about the woman in the footage. She looked more closely at the video and then made some phone calls to friends who worked at the Pentagon. "Oh my God," Jennifer posted on social media 3 hours later. "I think that's General Patricia Williams. She's one of the highest-ranking black women in the military. She briefed our unit when I was deployed overseas." Jennifer's post was shared hundreds of times within the first hour. Military personnel and veterans began recognizing Patricia and sharing their own stories about meeting her or serving under her command. The comments painted a picture of a respected leader who had dedicated her life to serving her country. By noon, the hashtag #TheSarGeneralWilliams was trending on multiple platforms. The original video had been viewed over 1 million times, and dozens of news outlets were picking up the story. Local TV stations began reaching out to the police department for comment. The department's first response was a standard statement. The officers involved followed proper procedures during a routine traffic stop. The individual in question was non-compliant and resistant to lawful orders. But people who watched the video could see for themselves that Patricia had been calm and cooperative throughout the entire interaction. The police department's statement only made people angrier. Military news websites picked up the story next. "Pentagon General Handcuffed During Traffic Stop" became the headline on every major military publication. Active duty soldiers began sharing the video with their own comments about the respect they had for General Williams. Patricia didn't know about any of this yet. She had been released from police custody around 1 a.m. with a citation for failure to comply with lawful orders, a charge that carried a small fine but could have serious implications for someone with a security clearance. She drove home in shock, replaying the events of the evening over and over in her mind. She had handled international crises and life-or-death military situations, but she had never felt as powerless as she did during that traffic stop. Patricia fell asleep around 3 a.m., exhausted and emotionally drained. She planned to call a lawyer in the morning and file a complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division. She had no idea that millions of people were already watching her story unfold online. Her phone started ringing at 6 a.m. The first call was from her assistant at the Pentagon, who had seen the news reports. The second call was from her sister, who had been contacted by reporters. By 7 a.m., Patricia had received calls from 3 different news stations, 2 lawyers, and her commanding officer. "Patricia, are you okay?" asked Colonel James Mitchell, her longtime colleague and friend. "The whole Pentagon is talking about what happened to you." "The whole Pentagon?" Patricia asked, still not fully understanding the scope of what was happening. "It's all over the news and social media. That video of your arrest has been viewed millions of times. Everyone's outraged." Patricia turned on her television and saw her own face on the morning news. The anchor was discussing the incident while showing clips from the viral video. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Military General Handcuffed for Questioning Traffic Stop." She watched in amazement as news reporters interviewed military experts, civil rights lawyers, and community leaders about her case. Everyone seemed to agree that she had been treated unfairly, but seeing her personal situation discussed on national television felt surreal. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends, colleagues, and family members. Everyone wanted to know if she was okay and if they could help in any way. Her daughter called from college, upset and angry about what had happened to her mother. The story was growing bigger by the hour. News outlets were digging into Patricia's military record, highlighting her achievements and service to the country. Photos of her in uniform, receiving medals and leading troops, began circulating alongside the video of her arrest. People who had never heard of General Patricia Williams before yesterday were now learning about her distinguished career. They read about her deployments overseas, her leadership during military operations, and her role in training the next generation of military officers. The contrast between her service record and her treatment during the traffic stop was striking. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting her country, being handcuffed on a suburban street for asking legitimate questions. Veterans groups began organizing online. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the officer's actions. Military support groups created fundraising campaigns to help with her legal costs, even though Patricia hadn't asked for help. By the afternoon, the story had reached international news outlets. Patricia Williams had become a symbol of something much bigger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. She sat in her living room, watching the news coverage and reading the thousands of supportive messages flooding her social media accounts. People from all over the world were sharing their own stories of unfair treatment by police, and many were thanking her for handling the situation with such dignity. Patricia had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. She had never imagined that asking questions during a traffic stop would make her the center of a national conversation about police accountability and racial justice. But as she watched the story continue to grow, Patricia realized that this moment might be bigger than just her personal experience. Maybe something good could come from what had been one of the worst nights of her life. At 8:30 a.m., Defense Secretary Robert Morrison was having his morning briefing when his chief of staff rushed into the room with a tablet showing the viral video. "Sir, you need to see this immediately," the aide said. "It's about General Williams from Strategic Operations." Morrison watched the 3-minute video twice, his expression growing darker with each viewing. As the highest-ranking civilian official in the Department of Defense, he had worked closely with Patricia Williams on numerous occasions. He knew her to be one of the most professional and dedicated officers in the entire military. "Get me the Pentagon's legal team on the phone," Morrison said, standing up from his desk. "And I want to speak with General Williams personally within the hour." By 9 a.m., word of the incident had reached every level of military leadership. Joint Chiefs Chairman Admiral Lisa Chen was in a meeting about overseas operations when her aide passed her a note about the situation. She immediately called for a recess. "This is unacceptable," Admiral Chen told her staff. "General Williams is one of our finest officers. The way she was treated is a disgrace, and it reflects poorly on how civilian authorities view our military personnel." The response from military leadership was swift and unprecedented. Within hours, statements began flowing from every branch of the armed forces. The Army Chief of Staff issued a personal statement supporting General Williams. The Secretary of the Navy called her treatment completely inappropriate. Even retired generals began speaking out on news programs. Defense Secretary Morrison personally called Patricia Williams at 10:15 a.m. "General Williams, this is Robert Morrison. I want you to know that the entire Department of Defense stands behind you 100%. Patricia was still trying to process everything that was happening. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate your support. General, what happened to you was wrong on every level. You are one of our most respected officers, and the way those police treated you is completely unacceptable. I want you to know that we are going to use every resource at our disposal to ensure accountability. Sir, I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to other people." "It won't if I have anything to say about it," Morrison replied firmly. By noon, the Pentagon had released an official statement that was unlike anything they had ever issued about a civilian law enforcement incident. "General Patricia Williams is an exemplary officer who has served our nation with distinction for over 25 years. She has led troops in combat, advised senior military leadership, and represents the very best of our military values. The treatment she received during a routine traffic stop is completely inconsistent with her character and service record. We call on local authorities to conduct a thorough investigation into this incident and take appropriate action." The statement was shared thousands of times within the first hour. Military families, veterans, and active duty personnel felt validated that their leadership was standing up for one of their own. But the Pentagon's response went far beyond public statements. Behind the scenes, high-ranking military officials were making phone calls to their contacts in federal law enforcement, congressional offices, and even the White House. Admiral Chen personally called the FBI Civil Rights Division to ensure they were aware of the incident. "This isn't just about one officer," she explained to FBI Director Patricia Collins. "This is about how civilian law enforcement treats military personnel. We need to know this was an isolated incident and not part of a pattern." The military's legal team began researching precedents for how the Department of Defense could support personnel who faced discrimination from civilian authorities. They discovered that there were established procedures for protecting military members from local harassment. But these procedures were rarely used. Within the Pentagon, Patricia Williams' colleagues were rallying around her. Officers who had served with her over the years began sharing their own stories about her leadership and character. Lieutenant Colonel David Torres, who had served under her command overseas, told reporters, General Williams saved my unit during a difficult mission in Afghanistan. She's the kind of leader who puts her soldiers first and never asks anyone to do something she wouldn't do herself. The idea that she was non-compliant or resistant is absolutely ridiculous to anyone who knows her. Military personnel around the world began posting photos of themselves with General Williams from various assignments and deployments. Social media filled with stories of her mentoring young officers, her dedication to military families, and her reputation for fairness and professionalism. The contrast between these testimonials and the police officer's description of her as argumentative and resistant became more stark with each passing hour. By afternoon, congressional representatives who served on military affairs committees began calling for investigations. Representative Michael Johnson, a veteran himself, issued a statement saying, "General Williams has served our country with honor for decades. If our military leaders can be treated this way during routine traffic stops, what does that say about how we value military service? Congress needs to examine this incident closely." The Pentagon's response was having its intended effect. Local news stations began reaching out to the police department with tougher questions. Instead of just reporting on the viral video, reporters were now asking why police officers would treat a respected military general so poorly. The police department's initial response had been to defend their officers and suggest that Patricia Williams had been uncooperative. But with the full weight of the Pentagon supporting her, that narrative was becoming harder to maintain. Police Chief William Davis found himself fielding calls from reporters asking about his department's training on dealing with military personnel. He also received calls from federal officials asking about his department's procedures for investigating misconduct complaints. "We are reviewing the incident thoroughly," Chief Davis told reporters during a hastily arranged press conference. "We take all complaints seriously and will investigate this matter fully." But his carefully worded statements rang hollow against the backdrop of overwhelming military support for General Williams. The Pentagon had made it clear that they considered the incident an attack on one of their finest officers, and they weren't going to let it slide. That evening, Defense Secretary Morrison appeared on the national news to discuss the incident personally. "General Williams represents the best of American military leadership," he told the anchor. "She has dedicated her life to serving our country, and she deserves to be treated with the same respect we would show any citizen. Actually, more respect, given her service and sacrifice." The interview was viewed by millions of people and shared widely on social media. Military families felt proud to see their leadership standing up for one of their own so forcefully. As the day ended, it was clear that the Pentagon's response had fundamentally changed the narrative around Patricia Williams' arrest. This was no longer just a story about a traffic stop gone wrong. It had become a story about how America treats its military heroes, and the military establishment was making sure everyone knew they were watching. The pressure from the Pentagon and national media attention forced the police department to launch a formal internal investigation. What they discovered was far more troubling than anyone had expected. Detective Lisa Rodriguez from Internal Affairs was assigned to lead the investigation into Officers Martinez and Thompson. Rodriguez had been with the department for 15 years and had investigated dozens of misconduct complaints. She started by reviewing the body camera footage from the night of Patricia Williams' arrest. What she saw immediately raised red flags. The footage clearly showed Patricia Williams being polite and cooperative throughout the entire interaction. There was no evidence of the argumentative or resistant behavior that both officers had described in their reports. But Rodriguez decided to dig deeper. She pulled the personnel files for both Martinez and Thompson and began reviewing their previous interactions with the public. What she found was deeply concerning. Over the past 3 years, Officers Martinez and Thompson had received a combined total of 27 complaints from citizens. Most of these complaints involved allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, or unprofessional conduct during routine traffic stops. The pattern was unmistakable. Both officers consistently escalated minor traffic violations into confrontational encounters, particularly when dealing with Black and Hispanic drivers. Previous complaints described scenarios remarkably similar to Patricia Williams' experience: polite citizens asking reasonable questions, only to be treated as threats and subjected to unnecessary force. Detective Rodriguez found one particularly disturbing case from 8 months earlier. A black college student named Kevin Johnson had been pulled over for allegedly not using his turn signal. When Kevin politely asked to see the officer's radar reading, Martinez had arrested him for obstruction of justice. The charges were later dropped, but Kevin had spent a night in jail and missed important midterm exams. Another case involved Maria Santos, a Hispanic nurse driving home from her night shift at the hospital. Thompson had pulled her over, claiming she was driving suspiciously through her own neighborhood. When Maria asked what she had done wrong, she was handcuffed and detained for 2 hours while Thompson searched her car without finding anything illegal. The more Rodriguez investigated, the clearer the pattern became. These officers were not just having one bad night with General Williams. They had been systematically mistreating citizens for years, and the department had failed to take action. Rodriguez discovered that most of the previous complaints had been dismissed without proper investigation. The typical response was to interview the officers, who would deny any wrongdoing, and then close the case for lack of evidence. Citizens who filed complaints were rarely interviewed thoroughly, and body camera footage was not always reviewed. The investigative file on Martinez and Thompson grew thicker by the day. Rodriguez found evidence of racial bias training that both officers had skipped. She discovered that Thompson had received multiple warnings about his aggressive behavior, but had never faced serious consequences. Most damning of all, Rodriguez found internal emails between the officers that showed they were aware their behavior was problematic. In one email from 6 months earlier, Martinez had joked to Thompson about attitude adjustments they gave to mouthy civilians. Thompson had responded with laughing emojis. When word of these findings began to leak to local reporters, the story took on a new dimension. This wasn't just about one incident with a military general. It was about a systemic pattern of misconduct that had been ignored by police leadership for years. Community activists who had been fighting police misconduct in the area felt vindicated, but frustrated. They had been complaining about these officers for years, but their voices had been ignored until a high-ranking military officer was affected. "We've been telling people about Martinez and Thompson for a long time," said community organizer Angela Davis during a local news interview, but nobody listened until they messed with someone who had connections to the Pentagon. What about all the regular citizens they've been mistreating? The investigation expanded beyond just the two officers. Rodriguez began examining the department's entire complaint process and supervision structure. She found that sergeants and lieutenants had repeatedly failed to properly investigate misconduct allegations. In some cases, supervisors had actively discouraged citizens from filing formal complaints. Federal investigators from the Department of Justice also began their own review of the department's practices. They requested all personnel files, training records, and complaint data from the past 5 years. What they found supported Rodriguez's findings: a department that had systematically failed to hold officers accountable for misconduct. The investigation revealed that the department's leadership had been aware of problems with Martinez and Thompson, but had chosen to ignore them. Internal memos showed that previous police chiefs had received warnings about both officers but had taken no meaningful action. One particularly damaging document was a memo from a retired sergeant who had warned about Thompson's pattern of escalating routine stops into arrests 3 years earlier. The memo had been filed away and forgotten, and Thompson had continued patrolling without additional oversight. As news of the investigation's findings became public, more victims began coming forward. Citizens who had been afraid to file complaints against Martinez and Thompson felt empowered to tell their stories. The local newspaper published a series of articles featuring interviews with people who had been mistreated by the two officers. The stories painted a picture of a community that had been terrorized by aggressive policing tactics while department leadership looked the other way. Patricia Williams watched the investigation unfold with mixed emotions. She was glad that the truth was coming out, but she felt terrible that so many other people had been mistreated while nothing was done to stop it. "I had the privilege of rank and connections that helped my story get attention," she told reporters. "But what about all the people who were treated badly and had no voice? That's what really bothers me about this whole situation." The investigation also revealed problems with the department's training and supervision. officers were not being taught proper de-escalation techniques, and supervisors were not reviewing body camera footage regularly to identify problematic behavior. Defense Secretary Morrison, who had been following the investigation closely, issued another statement as the findings became public. The investigation has confirmed what we suspected from the beginning, that General Williams was the victim of a pattern of misconduct that should have been stopped years ago. This is exactly why we responded so strongly to her treatment. Military personnel deserve better, and so do all citizens. The investigation had started as a review of one traffic stop, but it had uncovered a much larger problem. A department that had failed to protect its community from officers who had been abusing their authority for years. As Detective Rodriguez compiled her final report, she knew that her findings would lead to significant changes in the department. The question now was whether those changes would come fast enough to prevent other citizens from experiencing what Patricia Williams and so many others had endured. Within a week of the viral video, Patricia Williams' case had attracted the attention of some of the country's most prominent civil rights attorneys. The law firm of Johnson & Associates, known for handling high-profile police misconduct cases, offered to represent her free of charge. Attorney Michael Johnson had been watching the case unfold with great interest. As a former military officer himself, he felt personally invested in ensuring that Patricia received justice. General Williams represents everything that's right about military service, Johnson told reporters. The way she was treated is not just an attack on her personally, it's an attack on the values our military represents. The legal team immediately filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against officers Martinez and Thompson, as well as the police department itself. The lawsuit alleged that Patricia's constitutional rights had been violated and that the department had failed to properly train and supervise its officers. But the legal action was just the beginning. As news of the internal investigation's findings spread, federal authorities began taking a much closer look at the entire police department. The Department of Justice announced that it was opening a formal investigation into the department's practices. Federal prosecutors began reviewing evidence to determine if criminal charges were warranted against the officers or department leadership. When police officers violate citizens' civil rights, they must be held accountable, said U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh during a press conference. We are committed to ensuring that justice is served in this case. The announcement of federal involvement sent shockwaves through the local police department. Officers who had previously supported Martinez and Thompson began distancing themselves. Police union representatives who had initially defended the two officers became noticeably quiet. Meanwhile, political pressure was mounting from multiple directions. State legislators who represented the district began calling for investigations into police practices. The governor's office issued a statement expressing concern about the allegations and promising to monitor the situation closely. Local city council members found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They had previously supported the police department and its leadership, but the overwhelming evidence of misconduct was impossible to ignore. Councilwoman Patricia Lee, who had been a strong supporter of the police, was forced to reconsider her position after reviewing the investigation findings. I have always believed in supporting our law enforcement officers, she said during a city council meeting. But the evidence in this case suggests systematic problems that we cannot ignore. The citizens of our community deserve better. The political pressure intensified when several major civil rights organizations joined the case. The NAACP announced that they were monitoring the situation closely and would provide support for any additional victims who came forward. This case represents exactly the kind of systematic misconduct that we have been fighting against for decades, said NAACP President Kevin Williams. We will not let this slide just because it happened in a small suburban community. The American Civil Liberties Union also weighed in, filing their own lawsuit demanding reforms to the police department's policies and procedures. They argued that the department's failure to address misconduct complaints had created a culture where officers felt free to violate citizens' rights. As the legal and political pressure mounted, more disturbing details about the department's practices came to light. Investigative reporters discovered that the city had quietly settled several previous lawsuits against Martinez and Thompson without admitting wrongdoing. These settlements had been kept confidential, which meant that the public had no idea that the city had been paying out money to resolve complaints against these officers for years. The total amount of settlements exceeded $400,000, all of which had come from taxpayer funds. Local taxpayers were outraged when they learned that their money had been used to cover up police misconduct without their knowledge. City council meetings became heated affairs as citizens demanded answers about why problem officers had been allowed to continue working. "We've been paying for these officers' misconduct for years without even knowing it," said local resident Carol Martinez during one council meeting. "How many more settlements are we going to have to pay before someone does something about this?" The financial implications of the case began to worry city officials. Patricia Williams' lawsuit was seeking significant damages, and the federal investigation could result in expensive court-ordered reforms to the police department. Insurance companies that provided liability coverage for the city began reviewing their policies. Some threatened to cancel coverage if the city didn't take immediate action to address the misconduct problems. The political fallout extended beyond the local level. State politicians who had previously supported tough-on-crime policies found themselves having to explain how they would prevent future incidents like Patricia Williams' arrest. Congressional representatives from the area faced questions about federal oversight of local police departments. Some began calling for new legislation that would make it easier for federal authorities to investigate and prosecute civil rights violations by police officers. The case became a talking point in political campaigns across the state. Candidates were forced to take positions on police reform and accountability measures that they might have preferred to avoid. National civil rights leaders saw the case as an opportunity to push for broader reforms. They pointed to Patricia Williams' treatment as evidence that police misconduct affects all communities, not just urban areas that typically receive more attention. "If this can happen to a military general in a suburban community, it can happen to anyone," said civil rights activist Dr. Angela Davis during a television interview. "This case shows why we need systematic reform of policing at every level." The legal proceedings moved forward rapidly due to the clear evidence of misconduct. The body camera footage left little room for the officers to deny what had happened, and the investigation had uncovered a paper trail of previous problems. Patricia Williams' legal team filed motions seeking access to all personnel records for both officers, as well as training materials and supervision records. They wanted to establish that the department had been negligent in allowing the officers to continue working despite repeated complaints. Not the officers. Attorneys tried to argue that their clients had acted appropriately given the circumstances, but this argument became increasingly difficult to maintain as more evidence of misconduct emerged. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Patricia Williams and strong disapproval of the officers' actions. Even in the local community, where police typically enjoyed strong support, residents were turning against Martinez and Thompson. The case had evolved from a simple traffic stop into a comprehensive examination of police accountability and civil rights. Political leaders at every level were being forced to take positions and propose solutions. As the legal proceedings continued, it became clear that this case would have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond 2 police officers and 1 traffic stop. The Pentagon's initial support for General Williams had been strong, but as more details emerged about the systematic misconduct within the police department, military leadership decided to take unprecedented action. Defense Secretary Morrison called an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss how the military should respond to what was clearly a pattern of discrimination against service members. "This is bigger than just General Williams," Morrison told the assembled military leaders. "We have active duty personnel and veterans living in communities across this country. If local police departments think they can mistreat our people without consequences, we need to send a clear message that they're wrong." The Pentagon's legal team had been researching the extent of the military's authority to protect service members from civilian law enforcement misconduct. What they found was a complex web of federal laws and regulations that gave the military significant leverage when needed. One of the most powerful tools at their disposal was the military's control over federal contracts and funding that flowed to local governments. The police department that had employed Martinez and Thompson received significant federal funding through various grant programs, many of which were administered through military channels. Within days, The Pentagon announced that it was conducting a comprehensive review of all federal contracts and funding streams that benefited the local jurisdiction. This review would examine whether the recipients were meeting federal standards for civil rights compliance. The announcement sent shockwaves through the local government. Federal funding represented millions of dollars in annual revenue for the city, supporting everything from emergency response equipment to community development programs. City Manager Robert Davis received a formal letter from the Pentagon's contracting office requesting detailed information about the police department's policies and procedures. The letter made it clear that continued federal funding would depend on the city's response to the misconduct allegations. We are reviewing all relationships with your jurisdiction to ensure that federal taxpayer dollars are not supporting organizations that violate the civil rights of military personnel or other citizens, the letter stated. But the Pentagon's response went beyond financial pressure. Military leadership began reaching out directly to state and local officials to express their concerns about the treatment of service members. Admiral Chen personally called the state governor to discuss the situation. "Governor, we have hundreds of thousands of military personnel and their families living in your state," she said during the call. "We need to know that they will be treated fairly by local law enforcement." The governor, who relied heavily on military installations for economic development in the state, assured Admiral Chen that the matter would receive immediate attention. Within hours, the governor's office announced that it was launching its own investigation into police practices in the affected jurisdiction. The Pentagon also took the unusual step of issuing new guidance to all military personnel about their rights during civilian law enforcement encounters. This guidance included specific instructions on how to report misconduct and contact information for military legal assistance. More importantly, the Pentagon established a new office within the Inspector General's department specifically to investigate incidents where military personnel were mistreated by civilian authorities. This office would have the authority to coordinate with federal law enforcement and recommend actions to protect service members. The creation of this office sent a clear message. The military was not going to passively accept the mistreatment of its personnel. If local authorities couldn't police themselves, the federal government would step in. Defense Secretary Morrison took the unprecedented step of personally visiting the affected community to meet with local officials. His visit was covered extensively by national media and drew large crowds of supporters who wanted to show their support for General Williams. During his visit, Morrison met privately with the mayor and city council members. According to sources present at the meeting, Morrison made it clear that the Pentagon expected immediate and comprehensive reforms to the police department. "We invest billions of dollars in training and developing our military leaders," Morrison told the local officials. "When one of our finest officers is treated like a criminal for asking legitimate questions, that reflects poorly on your community and your values." The Pentagon also began coordinating with other federal agencies to ensure a comprehensive response. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced that it would review all services provided in the area to ensure that veterans were being treated appropriately by local authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation increased its presence in the community and began interviewing additional victims of police misconduct. FBI agents made it clear that they were taking the case seriously and would pursue federal charges if the evidence supported them. Military installations near the affected community implemented new policies requiring them to track any incidents involving their personnel and local law enforcement. Base commanders were instructed to report any problematic interactions immediately to Pentagon leadership. The Pentagon's response also included a comprehensive review of relationships between military installations and local police departments across the country. This review would identify any other communities where similar problems might exist and take proactive steps to address them. Local military recruitment offices reported increased interest from young people who had been inspired by the Pentagon's strong response to the Williams case. Many potential recruits mentioned that they were impressed by how the military stood up for its people. The economic impact of the Pentagon's actions became clear within weeks. Several federal contracts with local businesses were put on hold, pending the outcome of the civil rights investigation. A planned expansion of a nearby military facility was postponed indefinitely. Local business leaders, who had initially stayed quiet about the police misconduct, began pressuring city officials to resolve the situation quickly. They understood that the community's economic future depended on maintaining good relationships with the federal government. The police union representing Martinez and Thompson found themselves isolated as the Pentagon's pressure mounted. Union leaders who had initially promised to fight the charges began seeking plea negotiations for their members. Even retired military officers who lived in the community began speaking out. Veterans organizations that had previously supported the police department unconditionally started demanding accountability and reform. The Pentagon's coordinated response had achieved something that years of community complaints had not. It forced immediate and serious action on police misconduct. Local officials who had previously dismissed civilian complaints could not afford to ignore pressure from the Department of Defense. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Pentagon's involvement had fundamentally changed the power dynamic in the community. Military leadership had demonstrated that they would use all available resources to protect their personnel from mistreatment. The message was clear: if you mistreat a member of the United States military, you will face consequences from the most powerful military organization in the world, and those consequences would be swift, comprehensive, and decisive. The pressure from federal investigations, military leadership, and public outrage created an impossible situation for Officers Martinez and Thompson. Within 3 months of Patricia Williams' arrest, both men had resigned from the police force in disgrace. The resignation letters were brief and offered no apology for their actions. Martinez cited personal reasons for his departure, while Thompson claimed he was seeking new opportunities in private security, but everyone knew the real reason. They had been given the choice to resign or face termination and criminal charges. The resignations came just days before the Department of Justice announced that federal prosecutors would be filing civil rights charges against both officers. Even though they were no longer police officers, they would still face criminal prosecution for violating Patricia Williams's constitutional rights. Resigning from their positions does not absolve these individuals of criminal responsibility for their actions, announced U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh. Civil rights violations are serious federal crimes, and we will pursue these cases to the full extent of the law. The criminal charges sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Police officers who had been watching the case suddenly realized that the consequences for misconduct could extend far beyond losing their jobs. But the resignations were just the beginning of the changes that would sweep through the police department. Police Chief William Davis, who had initially defended his officers' actions, found his position becoming increasingly untenable as more evidence of systemic problems emerged. The federal investigation had uncovered emails and documents showing that Chief Davis had been aware of multiple complaints against Martinez and Thompson but had failed to take meaningful action. Internal affairs records showed that he had personally dismissed several misconduct complaints without proper investigation. City council members, facing enormous pressure from both federal authorities and angry constituents, began calling for Davis's resignation. Local business leaders, worried about the economic impact of continued federal scrutiny, privately urged the mayor to make changes in police leadership. The final blow came when the Department of Justice released a scathing report on the police department's practices. The report documented systematic failures in training, supervision, and accountability that had allowed misconduct to flourish for years. The department's leadership failed in its fundamental duty to protect citizens' constitutional rights, the report concluded. Immediate and comprehensive reforms are necessary to restore public trust and ensure compliance with federal law. 3 days after the report's release, Chief Davis announced his resignation. In his resignation letter, he finally acknowledged that mistakes were made in the handling of misconduct complaints, though he stopped short of accepting personal responsibility. The search for a new police chief became a national story, as the city struggled to find someone willing to take on the challenge of rebuilding a department under federal oversight. Several candidates withdrew their applications after learning about the extent of reforms that would be required. Eventually, The city hired retired FBI supervisor Maria Rodriguez, who had extensive experience in civil rights investigations and police reform. Her first act as chief was to implement comprehensive changes to the department's policies and procedures. Under Rodriguez's leadership, the department implemented mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Body cameras became required equipment for every patrol officer, and the footage was reviewed regularly by supervisors. A new civilian oversight board was established to investigate misconduct complaints independently. The changes extended beyond just policies and procedures. The department's culture underwent a fundamental transformation, as Rodriguez made it clear that misconduct would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Meanwhile, the federal prosecution of Martinez and Thompson moved forward, despite their attempts to avoid responsibility. Both men initially pleaded not guilty to the civil rights charges, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The body camera footage from Patricia Williams' arrest was played repeatedly in court, showing exactly how the officers had escalated a routine traffic stop into an arrest. Federal prosecutors also presented evidence of the officers' pattern of misconduct with other citizens. After months of legal proceedings, both Martinez and Thompson accepted plea agreements that included prison sentences and lifetime bans from working in law enforcement. Martinez was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, while Thompson received a 2-year sentence due to his longer history of misconduct. The sentencing hearing drew national attention as Patricia Williams herself addressed the court. Her statement was measured and dignified, focusing not on revenge but on the importance of accountability and reform. "I don't take any pleasure in seeing these men go to prison," she told the judge, "but their actions had consequences that extended far beyond one traffic stop. They violated the trust that citizens place in law enforcement, and they need to be held accountable for that." The civil lawsuit filed by Patricia Williams' legal team also reached a successful conclusion. The city agreed to a settlement that included a substantial monetary payment to General Williams, as well as binding commitments to continue the police reforms that had been implemented. But perhaps more importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring the city to maintain the civilian oversight board and continue federal monitoring of the police department for at least 5 years. The long-term impact of the Patricia Williams case extended far beyond one police department. Military installations across the country implemented new protocols for supporting personnel who faced discrimination from civilian authorities. The Pentagon's response to the case became a model for how federal agencies could use their influence to protect civil rights at the local level. Other departments began reviewing their own relationships with local governments to ensure they weren't supporting organizations that violated citizens' rights. Law enforcement training academies across the country began using the Patricia Williams case as an example of how routine interactions could escalate unnecessarily when officers failed to follow proper procedures. The case became required study material for police recruits in many states. Patricia Williams herself became a sought-after speaker on topics of leadership, civil rights, and police reform. She used her platform to advocate for changes that would prevent other citizens from experiencing what she had endured. "This case was never just about me," she told audiences during her speaking engagements. "It was about how we treat all citizens, especially those who may not have the resources or connections to fight back when they're treated unfairly." The community where the arrest occurred underwent its own transformation. Property values initially declined as the negative publicity hurt the area's reputation, but they recovered as the police reforms took hold and residents regained confidence in local law enforcement. Local civil rights organizations that had been fighting police misconduct for years finally felt that their voices were being heard. The Patricia Williams case had provided the catalyst for changes they had been seeking for decades. 5 years after the incident, the police department had become a model for other communities seeking to implement meaningful reforms. Officer misconduct complaints had dropped dramatically, and community trust in law enforcement had been largely restored. Officers Martinez and Thompson, meanwhile, faced continued consequences for their actions long after their prison sentences ended. Both men struggled to find employment, as their federal convictions made them unemployable in most fields that required background checks. The case had demonstrated that police misconduct could have career-ending consequences not just for the officers involved, but for the supervisors and administrators who failed to address problems when they were identified. Most importantly, the Patricia Williams case had shown that accountability was possible when enough pressure was applied from the right sources. The Pentagon's decisive response had proven that even local police departments could be forced to change when federal authorities decided to take action. The lesson was clear. Treating citizens unfairly might have been tolerated in the past, but in an era of viral videos and federal oversight, misconduct would have serious and lasting consequences for everyone involved.